Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Professor Sawyer sat across from me, seemingly astounded by my offer. Placing his wine gently back upon the table, he wiped his mouth with my good linen and stared across my long walnut, dark-stained table into my unwavering gaze.
"Oh, please, forgive me, Lord Langdale. It sounded like you said—"
"Yes," I purposely interrupted.
"Well, I'm meant to be home very soon. I must have certainly overstayed my welcome,"
he meekly added, placing the linen down onto his half-eaten plate of food. "You were saying something, Professor," I interrupted.
"Well, it just sounds quite bizarre, if I'm being honest, sir,"
he half-heartedly pleaded. "Look good, sir. I have been quite charitable to your institutions, have I not? I've advocated on your behalf numerous times to bankers for the land that your group currently reside on, have I not? I have even presented myself as an adjunct professor within numerous sessions at the university as a favor to you in an effort to instruct your students on the finer points of negotiating commercial contracts, a role that the London facilities often pay me quite handsomely for, a hefty £50 per day on occasion, and here I was being a servant to you, a friend, someone that has influence in this country and has ensured that you were well taken care of, almost as soon as you and your lovely Catherine had arrived from Suffolk nearly 1 year ago," I explained. I tilted my head slightly as to beg his sense and to ensure that I had made my point as clearly as possible. "Surely, what I have asked of you is not out of order or nonsensical. Certainly quite possible. No?" I added. Professor Sawyer stood, fixed his specs, and looked down and around the table, searching his mind for any appropriate response.
"Sir, are you not aware of it's madness?"
"Excuse me, sir. You forget yourself," I lambasted.
"Poor choice of words. My apologies. What I mean is that what you've asked me, what you've instructed me to do, and with what seems like little consideration, it seems, for the abhorrent nature of your request, is just impossible."
"Professor, what I have asked of you is not impossible. It is not technically unethical. Unorthodox, yes, fine, but you have the capacity within you, within your role as headmaster of University of Manchester, to provide me with only a few cadavers from your science laboratories. These are rotting kilos of meat that you play with."
"Teach with, sir. They are a means of education and donations from the National Anatomical Donation Program."
"Whatever semantics you choose to operate under, they are still dead things. They are provisioned to you regularly. Why should you lose sleep over the expediting of 2 or 3 to me?" I implied with plain sense.
"For what, Lord Langdale? To what end? For what purpose? Why would any private man need a dead body?"
The professor erupted. This is something I can't divulge. You need to understand. I fund various organizations, and those many groups operate their own scientific research, and in order to complete their work, they require certain things, components that will further their work. Trust me, this work is all for mankind. This is not for me to decide for them. I'm happy to share the results with you once finalized, and I will. Yes. Here is what I'll do. I will promise to you that you will receive the first option for peer review and study and dissemination of the white papers. to your university shareholders. You will be a hero to the board and your faculty. What a tremendous opportunity.
No, sir, no. I cannot do this. There are protocols in place. These cadavers are heavily secured. Their families have given exclusive rights to the university, and if any were to go missing, it would be devastating for all involved. I just can't. I hope that you understand. Perhaps you can convince a cemetery keeper with a couple shillings to dig up something, but I'll have no part of this.
The professor exclaimed without any other thought or idea to recommend. I glared at Sawyer. This was insulting enough to move him towards the unexpected phase 2 quickly. Cemetery keeper. How dare he? This impudent troll. Professor. If you feel that you are not able to accommodate my ask, then I shall have no further need for encouraging funding to the university since, well, it has no support for me in my work. All influence shall cease for the university and, in fact, well, I will do my best to keep my mouth closed after a few brandies with some of your association's benefactors. Perhaps they may, God forbid, no longer see you as a competent headmaster. Goodness, no. What am I saying? Absolutely fiendish I am. I finished with a mischievous snigger.
But, sir, this is not right,
he replied. Well, Mr. Professor Sawyer, I shall see you out, shall I? Or you know the way. I gestured forward, fingers presenting the main hall direction. Tut, tut, well, my stomach is urging me to attend the toilet immediately. Goodbye, sir. I gave a slight nudge to the small of his back. My tall, gaunt, and somewhat skeletal servant, Crookshank, appeared from the hall.
This way, sir,
he said in a booming voice, with a glance to me, while I provided a knowing nod back to him. Farewell, Professor, and enjoy your cadavers. I finally waved cheekily with a smile and turned back towards the smoking room with my Cabernet and pipe. The professor stood staring at me, stunned at the speed in which he was dispatched from my home. Unceremoniously, yes, but I no longer needed him. Nor was he well behaved, if I'm being honest. He was guided through the door, into the rain, by Crookshank, and doors shut within centimeters of him as he departed. Oh, and Crookshank, have Tubbs and Arthur make it clean and covert.
Yes, sir,
he replied. A shame. He was a nice fellow, I whispered to myself as I took a seat. A man's terrified scream and the sound of a fleshy thud soon followed from outside in the distance. Listening intently, curled into my leather armchair, I took a wisp of pipe and then shouted a dictation to my butler. Crookshank, please send a message to his widow. Sorry, his wife. Dear Madam Sawyer, I'm rather upset that the dear professor could not show the commonplace courtesy of a message if he were not going to show up to a dinner I had so specially crafted for his pleasure when asked. I would have expected a man of his carriage to have made his unfortunate absence a thing of knowing for the gracious host. I requested.
Yes, sir, of course,
said my lanky accomplice. Oh, and tell our lads that when I demand it to be quiet, I expect it quiet, or they will be on the receiving end of the pickaxe on the next occasion.
Oh, sir, will you be expecting me to lock you in this evening?
Offered Crookshank. Yes, please do so, Edward. And then bring him to me, I said. I won't be able to stomach it until then.
Very good, my lord,
Offered the very obedient Edward Crookshank,
As you wish.
I am Lord Langdale, if you haven't speculated yet. My family has left me with massive tracts of land across the north of England. Therefore, I have developed some level of influence. Any farmer, factory owner, or educational or financial institute that operates on my land pays me tax. No, not federal tax. They pay me a bit of a divvy outside the Queen's demands. This is my land, my domain, my kingdom. Our family have been deed bearers of this land for over 2 centuries. The land is not the only thing that we have in common. A secret. Well, I suppose it is a secret inasmuch as we have never accounted for it in public. We have never offered up the truth, and this makes it scuttlebutt, or, let's say, inadmissible evidence, as the barrister that I ate last night would have properly termed it. My great-grandfather was Aldrich Langdale. He passed this secret on to my grandfather, Ellery Langdale, to my mother Mary Langdale, and then to me, Neville Langdale. We are a large group, our family, a bit of a widespread pack. So widespread were we at one time that we had agreed many decades ago that we would disperse globally, dozens of our family boarding ships for every part of the world. It was a bit too concentrated here for what we were. I expect my subjects to ensure my quality of life. I don't ever expect to work or engage in the trifles of business dealings, let alone the indignity of manual labor of any sort. So they can whisper, engage in talk of ghoulish fiends roaming the countryside for blood, and that's acceptable for me. This palpable fear continues to provide me with what I want. When they resist or become too fatiguing, well, you would do well to remember Professor Sawyer. He was an unfortunate case, yet a cautionary tale. I could have easily allowed him to walk away, home to his lovely wife, but this night I was particularly hungry, and not in the most tolerant spirit. I knew that if I didn't have something this evening, particularly fresh for my nightly meal, especially in my peckish state, I would have to make a decision to roam. When I roam, it is never pleasant. Much hysteria, painfully frustrating screams, but mostly it's risky for me. The less I am witnessed in my more alpha form, the better for me and my family. Most of my family here have passed away. My granddad could barely chew through a femur before he left us last year. My dear mother lives alone on a skip of land I had provided for her on the edge of my estate. She ate my father many years before. Reckless bit of business marrying a Lycan, to be fair. He took his chances. I feel reckless myself at times. I don't want Crookshank to lock me up during these bright evenings. I want to feel the freedom to run through the forests of this beautiful countryside and hunt. The breeze, the cold against my luscious fur, the sounds of hearts beating. Really, to hunt like I was created to do. I often feel impotent and weak when caged, like a pet. They really should thank me, however. I subject myself to this indignity to protect their way of life. Sometimes, I think I should consider my own desires over the petty lies of these odious peasants. No more than living, breathing kebabs. Crookshank had locked my holding cage, a 9-square-meter iron box that was approximately 5 meters high. When he finished, I nodded to him in recognition that he had done what I had asked him, as we both simultaneously understand that this is required, but never a pleasant situation. If I were to meander freely, even my poor Edward, the maids, the cook, and the gardening lads that do my real bloody work would not be safe. There is no sense, from a humanity perspective, when I am Lycan. When I am powerful and extricated from the bonds of sympathy and emotion, Now, it is important to understand that when the moon is in its fullest phase, I feel a madness that is even more profound than usual. But it is important to keep in mind that each night, regardless of the moon's exposure from the sun's illumination, I change. The fuller moon presents a gravity that pulls at your brain fluids or something like that. I once heard this explained during a lecture from a very talented academic specializing in astronomy and such. He was very entertaining, and for this I would have never dared to consume him. I tend to read with a small candle sat outside my cage while I wait for the unbearably painful transformation. Isn't that odd? Reading as a man of eloquence and rational thought prior to abruptly becoming something of nightmares. I once heard this story of a man in London named Dr. Henry Jekyll, who was convicted of terrible crimes under some alias. He developed a condition that allowed him to capitulate to his more barbaric temperaments. Well, he certainly didn't come by his infliction as honestly as I had. I feel the pressure mounting in my chest and my legs and then my head. A terrible headache forms, and that's when I know it's near. A sharp ache in my legs, as if they were being pulled apart on a torture device. My arms next. My chest, though. I feel my ribs fracturing. Hard to continue to illustrate these symptoms, but I will continue to try while my sanity remains even in its most vague state. Hair rapidly sprouts up across my arms and across my body. My clothes begin to tear, and throughout, the pain encapsulates my entire body and becomes unbearable. Swiftly, assisting the madness to overcome me, my screams fill the cellar, echoing throughout the mansion. What must they think of me upstairs when this happens? Fear, or only inconvenience? My butler, my maids, and other servants that have been entrusted to my secret and have kept it as caged as my physical presence, for fear of their swift punishment from fangs and claws. My head begins to crack. I can hear it inside. The pain gushes through my brain as my skull takes new form, pulls my face apart. I cannot think. I only feel pain, a pain that is as common for me as breath, yet never fully. Not make sense. I have grown larger, much larger, too large for this cage, yet trapped nonetheless. Powerful arms covered in deep black fur. Eyes now see throughout the pitch dark of my containment space. Watching rats scurry, I feel their heartbeats. I want meat. I crave blood and flesh. I crave living blood to rip apart. I need this. I need this. I see the corpse of Professor Sawyer, mostly intact, and I rip into its chest with my snout, deeply embedded into his intestines. Tearing apart chunks of flesh with tapered razor-sharp fangs, gulping down blood and flesh in my most savage condition. I cannot get enough. Crunching down on the skull from this now mess of gore, devouring bone and cartilage. Now lapping at the pool of blood left until my rusted metal cage is empty of nothing more than dried spots of liquids. I exhale, and then howl. I howl for both satisfaction and, conversely, hunger for more. This has merely whetted my appetite. I chew at the bars of the cage like a mindless beast, chewing upon the teeth marks left from every evening. This was the ritual that I engaged in after each feeding. I always wanted more. Eventually, after more howling, I slept. Awaking, in filth and sickness, as usual, is Lord Langdale. Like clockwork, Edward stands ready with cage opened and breakfast prepared upstairs. He wipes me down with a hot, wet cloth and assists me up the stairs. The pain has not yet left, and the capacity for walking unattended has not yet returned to me. I sit, alone, in my massive dining room and eat porridge, fish, eggs and bacon and sip my tea. Maria, my cook, always prepares extra as the first serving never stays long in my stomach. Then, after breakfast, I bathe, get dressed, and make my way to the town to collect what is mine. My security man, Gordon, accompanies me. He is a human beast of a man, nearly 200 centimeters in height and barrel-chested, nearly 7 stone, and a face that would make any normal man empty his bowels upon fiery glance. There are times when some of the merchants feel the need to instantly oppose my requests, and sometimes with tools. Gordon, then, would easily wrench the tools from their hands and nearly crush their throat, while they're lifted by the necks off the ground. Then it doesn't happen again. Gordon really is the reason why I collect easily. The stories of bogeymen are really a side thing, for the more supernatural of the county occupants. Would you like to hear something interesting? My alternate form really does dwarf Gordon, and when Gordon first saw me in this state, he quickly shat his pants and ran. If I were not caged, of course, not thinking as myself, I perhaps would have felt this a bit of fun and decimated him in seconds. I do love a good chase. We continued our stroll throughout the town square, and then a carriage ride to the outer reaches of the village, to the farms and small factories. They were waiting for us, and most putting on brave faces to provide me with food and, of course, my wages. I preferred coin over meat and vegetables. Meat I could come by quite easily, especially the type of meat that they do not distribute or sell. I arrived at the farm of Thomas Kennedy, an Irishman migrated years ago to my part of Old Blighty. A hard-working, ginger-haired, scrappy man of about 60, still muscular and tough. Kennedy often spoke little, and when educated about the way that commerce operates here in my country, he gave when he had to, but never without a look of repulsion and contempt. As long as he provided me with what I wanted, I don't care if he bawled and rolled about the dirt like a child. He gave, and he gave on time, and that's all I cared about. He poured the coins into Gordon's giant palm from a small leather satchel. Then I had noticed behind him a man, an apparent farmhand. How did I miss this behemoth? A giant, also ginger-headed, bearded, but a face of youth behind the beard. His eyes. Something about his eyes. They were silver blue. I'd never seen anything like him before. Immediately, I wondered to myself if he would be tough to eat, or bland due to his size. The smaller scallops and strawberries are always the most delicious. Isn't that the common suggestion? I have found that older people are terrible to eat. To spare you my more gruesome details, I won't continue in this line of thought.
My sister's boy. The plague took her in Galway and I took him in over here. He helps me with the livestock and the general farming. He's a strapping boy, quite capable.
Thomas Kennedy told me. I should say so. My word, the boy is a beast, I replied. I motioned for this large young man to come forward.
Farm boy, come here. I should like to speak with you.
Kennedy motioned to him that it was okay, and the farmhand motioned back. He walked towards me. He was different, easily 10 centimeters taller than Gordon, and more muscular. I should very much want this man to work for me, perhaps alongside Gordon as a protege. Gordon was getting quite advanced in age himself and would need someone to mentor, but there was something even more sinister about this farmhand. if you can believe it. Youthful face, bright eyes, an obvious attachment to kindness in his features, but he was trouble. I felt it. He had a strange scent. This was coming into realization as he moved towards me. I stopped him midway.
Wait. No, sir. On second thought, you may continue your work. I am a busy man and I must take my leave,
I said. Something off-putting about this young man. I gestured to Gordon to finish up the collection of some vegetables, along with the depositing of coins into our coffer, and we were off to the local tavern for a quick bite to eat. The rabbit was excellent, as were the pints of bitter ale. On the house, as you can imagine. I've heard whispers across the pub, in conversation, about missing townsfolk. I had ascertained from the miscellaneous chatter that at least 4 were gone missing. This was quite unusual because nobody leaves or dies without notification to a family or neighbor, and secondly, I was not out prowling. Well, not my concern, nor did I care. As we journeyed back to Langdale estate in my carriage, I could not stop thinking about this strange young man. I rarely felt disconcerted, light apprehension to a human before. He seemed to have sensed it also. I felt something in his eyes that seemed to resonate with a sense of anger or loathing towards me. Not a squint or peering of his eyes, just the pupils of his eyes and the flush of his face gave me a feeling of danger from him. It's very bizarre. Somewhat exhilarating, if I'm being honest. Then again, he was the largest being I had encountered, next to Gordon, and being a stranger, he piqued my interest, but hardly interested me after some time. Professor Sawyer was quickly replaced with one of his subordinates at the university. His wife continued to grieve, and his children were inconsolable. If I were not such a ghoul, utterly lacking of empathy, I would feel terrible for having deleted him from their lives. But I have more important things to attend to. I needed access to the anatomical locker of the university. They had dozens of regularly supplied corpses. This would be so much easier than having to truly work for it. I would invite the replacement headmaster to dinner, perhaps next month. Time to eliminate suspicion, of course. Either we make a deal, or he becomes my meal. I had some of the ladies come by for a bit of much-needed exertion after dinner. Then I spent the evening with my pipe and my book in the study. The fire was crackling, and the book was very good. Then, as the first pangs hit my stomach, I knew that I needed to get into the cellar. I took a long swig of whiskey to numb the pain, then had Edward ensure the lock was in place. He had more to gain from my security in the cage than I. I was beginning the evening's transformation, when just before my bones began to crack, and the pain took over my mental state, came a howl close by. This was absolutely not a wolf's howl. Many would interpret this as such, but I knew better. This was another, like me. I had not heard this in many years, since my mother stopped changing from the old age. There were no others like me in this vicinity. This was not a familiar. I know the howls of all of my family. They were like fingerprints. This was unfamiliar to me, a stranger. I was seconds away from losing my current consciousness before beginning a new one, so rational thought and assessment of my wolf and peer was fleeting. I heard one more howl, a fierce one filled with rage. Then I was gone. The new me was here now, inhabiting my mind, and now this new incarnation of me would not be considering the options, only smelling, listening, and now stuck in this cage, helpless to investigate. A night of savage madness. Biting, chewing on this cage for release. Release to hunt down this intruder. Lycan me did not have to wait long. This new thing was not only closer now. Its howls were replaced by growls. Then, as I gazed towards the moonlit exterior of my home, the courtyard view from the window of my cellar, a pair of glowing eyes, I went mad, roaring at the beast that had invaded my space. It remained far calmer and more collected, just baring its teeth at me. I at it was my enemy. Its coat was lighter than mine. Brown fur, red-tinged. This thing was new. It rolled its tongue across its fangs. I was stuck in this cage. I could not attack. I barked, yelped, howled. When Edward opened the cellar door to ensure that I was okay, alarmed at the unusual and erratic activity coming from me, in my cage, the hairy visitor disappeared from the window. Edward stared at me, as terrified as he had always been of me in this massive, terrible form. I was uncontrollable. He disappeared upstairs to fetch me a raw ribcage of cow. If I were in my alternate sane state, I would have wondered how he would have expected to feed me. With the cage locked and unlocked, he'd be in trouble. I soon came to understand that this was no longer an issue, since after the door had smashed open upstairs, various screams from across my home. Pure terror in the voices of my staff was enough to excite the beast enveloping me and anger me simultaneously. I tore at the cage. I ripped at the lock, wrapped my enormous claws around the bars, and shook with a pent-up fury that I had not felt before. I would tear myself apart to get out of this, to deal with this intruder with no mercy, or be destroyed trying. It was no use. I did not fatigue easily in this state, but the constant burst of energy, rattling and biting at these bars tired me, and as I lay, breathing, panting, listening to my surroundings, I recognize that the screams had ceased. I can only assume that my demon intruder had ended them all. All of my staff, those closest to me. I stood in my cage, claws closing into a fist and opening and closing. I listened as the heavy footsteps slowly made their way to the top of the cellar stairs, where my now deceased Crookshank had left the door opened. My chest heaved with angry breaths and low, involuntary rumbling gnarls. Then, slow, heavy steps descended down into my cellar, into my view. The dark hid nearly all, except the silhouette of something huge. Eyes glowing, it stood and surveyed me. I squinted with my bright red eyes to see it better. My position inside of the moonlight through the window provided my foe a better vantage. It was far larger than I, in any state. It moved forward in the moonlight. Its fur was reddish-brown, of course, matted with wet blood in parts. Long hair compared to my black, short, rough fur. I growled at it, bared my teeth. It did the same. It walked closer, and its wolfen snout sniffed at me, and then extended its bloodied face and chest forward, arms stretched back, and roared an ungodly roar that sent my claws to my ears to cover them. I had never heard a sound so loud. Suddenly, in the distance, town bells ringing. I could hear, even with my now damaged ears, the screaming of villagers in the distance. The bells continued, and this ginger beast made one final glare at me, as I did him, and it raced off up the stairs and out of the house into the distance. I must say, if I were not protected by this cage, the mere size and fury of this thing convinced me that I would be no match, and reduced to a pile of fur and flesh upon my cellar floor. I had never felt the sensation of being prey in my entire existence. Up until now, was the predator. Now prey stuck in a cage until I returned to human form. In the instance where I should need freeing from this enclosure, Edward and I had agreed that the keys would be easily reachable with human arms, on a hook on the wall nearby, unreachable with my mammoth Lycan arms, even in that condition where I could never use sense enough to unlock a lock. I had done so, and released myself the following morning, with little memory of what happened. I knew a tragedy had occurred, and that my staff were gone, and that there was another, like me. A strange thing. My terrible condition. I have no faculties, no capacity for rational thought, yet I remember, much like a drunk may do the following morning, fleeting elements of past occurrences. This was enough for me to know what had happened. Even sparks of images, visuals of the beast that were difficult to forget in any capacity. My staff were indeed gone. I confirmed this with a cursory survey of my mansion the following morning. Hannah and Anna, my maids, Maria, my cook, Tubbs and Arthur, my gardeners, and my dear Edward and my giant Gordon, all torn to pieces. Edward in the pantry and the rest in their bedrooms. I sincerely feel that they may have assumed that it was me loose in the house, and that I would appeal to my inner reason and not harm them. Otherwise, they would have tried to flee, I'm sure. I cleaned up the mess, stored the bodies in the cellar. Yes, there was no better way to dispose of them, as brutish as it seems. My horses were also dead, torn apart in the stables. I cleaned myself up and walked into town. It was easily an hour walk through the wooded pass. My estate was a 15-minute carriage ride to the village. It ran through a heavily wooded area. I had often thought of erecting a fence around my property, so that I may be loose in the evening, so that I may hunt deer and other creatures without attacking the village. This consideration was laid to rest when I realized that no fence would hold me in, if I truly felt a desire to wander further. It was approximately 10 a.m. when I reached the town, weary from the walk. I knew that I could easily pay one of these handsome cabs, horse-drawn carriages for hire, for my journey back. I immediately arrived at the Castle Hotel and tucked into a large breakfast with a pint of black. I had asked around for new hires. I needed to find replacements for my staff. This would be a rigorous task, as these servants would need to be made aware in fear of their absolute secrecy. My staff had been with me for over 20 years, and now they were gone. All of them. I'm not sure how I would go about acquiring new house help at this time, when the stories of my beastly existence had gathered steam over these last 2 decades. I immediately thought of the farmhand at the Kennedy place. I paid my meal and rushed out to a hired carriage, paid them a day's wage for their service, and had them take me directly out to the farm. I had to have this boy for my staff. He would need to replace Gordon. I would pay him handsomely, and he would need not lift a bale of hay again. Of course, I would compensate his uncle with adequate concessions, and he would come and stay with me, he would be made to understand the situation. I would sit him down, and under the penalty of fear and riches, he would eventually come to understand what I require from him. My bodyguard throughout my collections activity in public, and to assist me at home. I could easily lock myself in. Edward had crafted the Lycan-proof plan of having the keys close by, inaccessible to anything other than human arms, so I could easily lock myself in nightly and release myself in the morning. It would be helpful to have a new improved staff join immediately, and I had pegged this man as my first permanent hire. My carriage pulled up into the mud of the Kennedy's farm road, in front of their modest cabin. Instantly, Thomas, not recognizing the carriage, shouted that he wanted no bankers or collection agents on his property. I shouted back that it was just me, to his surprise. He walked carefully towards me. He seemed exceptionally watchful of me, distrustful of my presence, seemingly, in his eyes. He asked how he may be of service.
Thomas, my good man, where is the lad we met yesterday? Your nephew?
I asked.
What do you want of him?
He beckoned back, guardedly. He seemed to not be curious as to the whereabouts of my driver, and of Gordon, who had accompanied me to his homestead weekly for as long as Kennedy became a serf on my land.
Good Lord, man. I need only have a word with him about a rare opportunity,
I replied. Thomas eyed me and turned towards the house and shouted,
Liam, get your arse out here.
Beyond Thomas's shoulder, I saw the big man exit the cottage, head lowering to pass through the frame of the door. There's a good lad, I whispered to myself, admiring the size and potential of the giant.
Dear Mr. Kennedy, may we speak privately? I mean, your nephew and I
requested.
I would prefer that I'm present for the young lad's business. I'm responsible for his care as custodian, and he being in my charge in place of my dear deceased sister, his mother.
He responded thoughtfully.
I'm sure this is not an issue. May I step inside if you'd be so kind?
I asked. With slight hesitation, he gestured for me to come inside. We sat at his small, humble table that seemed handmade. He offered me tea. I declined and assured them both that I would be straight to the subject without delay. I would need to be attending my hired carriage and home before dark. They were relieved by this, it appeared. Well, let me preface this by thanking you for taking this time to listen to my proposal. My man Gordon, the large ape-like gentleman that so often accompanies me during my visits, he's fallen ill and had to return to Glasgow. Of course, I accepted this as my care for my employees is of my utmost priority. I digress. I am in need of an assistant, let's say. One of the right size stature, somewhat of an imposing figure, most succinctly, if I may. Someone like you, young Liam. I point my finger towards the lad, and I focus my attention towards him, even as we were all sat, was a solid quarter meter above me. He seemed confused. Thomas, his uncle, immediately protested. No, I'll have none of it. He's needed here with me. He's my primary help during farming season. I need to look after him. Nope, he stays in my employ and under my care, as he has for all this time. Thomas Kennedy made his case. The giant lad continued to peer from face to face during the debate with no bias towards either expectation. Thomas, just hold a minute, sir. I respect and understand your plight. I respect and understand your situation, the caring for the boy and the need for assistance on your property. Here is what I propose, and just hear me out, please. I continued. I will release you from any debt or serfdom payments to me in perpetuity. I will also pay 200 shillings for his service for 1 year. This is easily enough to acquire 2 or 3 hands to assist with the remaining of the farming season, which, I might add, will end in less than a month, which leaves you with a tidy profit. And, of course, no need to shelter or feed him. And you and I both know he requires a substantial budget for meals, I'm sure. I chuckled. So, I finished, Liam would stay with me, in exceptional accommodation, up at the house, accompany me weekly, and help me with odd jobs during the day. He could visit you as often as he likes, of course. I accepted this as a fabrication. I could not allow Liam to associate with his uncle once he is made aware of my secret. Thomas looked at Liam and ensured that he was okay with this agreement. Liam seemed happy to not care one way or the other, and upon leaving, I sensed a smile on his lips, happy to be ridding himself of manual labor and peasant living. We boarded the carriage after he took care of packing up his meager belongings and said goodbye to his uncle. We would have a very uncomfortable conversation shortly. The sooner, the better. The sky was getting dim, and we had a 45-minute journey yet to return to Langdale Manor. It would be a rapid education for young Liam. As we rode up the muddy road, my eye caught something ahead that contrasted with the dark wetness of the mud. I asked the driver to stop, out of curiosity. It was not more than 200 meters from the boys' home. I peered at the side of the carriage. Liam tried to look but could not see from his vantage point, especially with his head craned downwards due to his height. I peered closely, and it seemed to be... No, it was a large pile of vomit. My heart stopped as I noticed, within this large pile of sick, a hand. A man's hand, with a ring. This ring was very recognizable to me. This was the hand of Edward. The ring was a brass one, gifted to him by his late wife. My eyes had viewed this ring thousands of times over the past 20 years or so. This was Edward's hand, along with other bodily pieces too gnarled and half-digested to identify. Near it, footsteps on one side of a massive beast, much like my other self, trailing away in the direction of the Kennedy farm, were the footsteps of a man, barefoot man. My heart sunk. It was clear to me now, in an instant. Everything in one gleaning. The beast that visited last night and took the lives of my staff, destroyed my home, my horses, and was now a threat to my existence, was Ginger, and more massive than I could have imagined. Much like this boy, this beast. This was the very soul that was sat next to me in this carriage. He was unaware of my knowledge of this currently. All of my plans changed in that instant. My new hire, my new hope for a right hand, was now my enemy. A thing that must be dealt with. He would need to be destroyed. Before dark, of course. One thing now tugged at my mind. His mother had died. I think that I know how, after all.
Carry on, driver!
The carriage driver whipped the horses and we carried on. To home, where my vengeance and punishment await. My mood was dark now, and it was difficult to conceal. I did my best to appear cheerier and feign happy conversation. Luckily, Liam was not a talker. He barely uttered more than a few words in his thick Irish brogue. We arrived at the manor. We dismounted as I asked the driver to bring the bags into the foyer. Liam stood outside, staring at the house. He was astounded at its size. He seemed somewhat happy to now be residing in a mansion. I whispered to myself between grinding teeth, with seething rage, "You should not seem so happy. You bastard. You should be afraid." Why was he not connecting his nocturnal activities to this place? Why was he not remembering this location as an obvious recollection? He should be repelled from it rather than smiling. Does he not have the ability to remember as I do? Too young? Too dark last evening? No matter. He will no longer be of any further thought soon. Then I would need to deal with his uncle. He would be snooping for his nephew soon enough. He would be trouble. The two would need to be removed. First, though, with pleasure, this beast. Then I shall think on him no more, and I shall never again fear his visits in the night. Easy enough. We walked into the house. I, of course, showed him around to the kitchen, pantry, parlor, my smoking room, the atrium in the back, as I felt no need to show him the upstairs. We walked towards the tool shed. I told him that I wanted him to see where we kept the tools. In a muddled and half-intelligent manner, he asked where the staff were. I was now certain of something that was kept from me. This boy was not mentally acute. He was feeble-minded. This is why he spoke so little and was used as an ox at the Kennedy farm. Well, in the evening, he was a murderous ghoul. That is why he must be disposed of. I walked him into the tool structure in the back of the property. I knew the driver had left, paid, and now he was off the property. As we peered around, I allowed him to look around. This is when I took the shears from the wall. And as he looked more closely at the plow, I drove the pointed end of the shears into his back, as hard and deeply as I could muster. He howled in shock and pain. He obviously had no breath in him due to the predicament. Blood gushed from him. I dared not look him in the eyes. I had felt some sadness, after all, about this, but I was certain that he was my foe. He had this coming, for murdering my staff, my horses, and showing up at my home as a menace. He may not have deserved this as a young lad, but he certainly would deserve this for his beast persona. I twisted it to make the death as quick as possible. He slumped to the ground. Blood drenched the dirt floor from his mouth and his wound. This mountain of a man would be nearly impossible for me to shift from here. I would need to reduce him to pieces. Not the work that I typically engage in, but as it was getting dark, I needed to get below. And I'd deal with this mess tomorrow. I locked the shed door. Leaving this body made me both satisfied and somewhat melancholy. It was not the first time that I had taken life, but most certainly my first in human form. And I did not enjoy it, I will tell you. I knew he had to be removed, but he was just a dim giant of a lad that was innocent enough in his human form, obviously. I would take the beef ribs that Edward had prepared for me in the evening into the cage with me and lock myself in. I lit a half-dozen candles in the cellar for a bit of light, now that I was alone and somewhat not as comfortable in the dark as I was the prior evenings. I entered my enclosure feeling somewhat helpless, knowing that for the very first time, I was alone. No Edward, Gordon, or the ladies to assist me if I needed. Then there was nothing more to worry about. I locked the large iron padlock and placed the key arm's length on the wall. Barely able to get my human arm between that part of the enclosure, but just enough. I would change, hopefully sleep, and start the new day with the rest of my new hires to be acquired. No more danger from our ginger-haired monstrosity, now that he has been dealt with. Alone in my vast mansion, in a cage. A strange world this has become. After an hour or so of laying in my cage, contemplating my tasks ahead, I began my transformation. I could see my own shadow by candlelight, and it was disturbing to watch my legs elongated in shadow on the wall, while I screamed and writhed in pain. The cracking of bone and tearing of sinew as I eventually stood. The Alpha. Once again, the most terrible creature of this land, ripping into my dinner, smelling the mutilated remains of the body in the shed. I had not considered the madness caused by that scent when I left it there. I, instead, continued to chew on my bits of cow, crunched on the bone. I typically left nothing to waste. It would be enough. I licked my mouth and wiped my claws across my toothy snout for any residual blood from my dinner. Then, shock overtook me as I heard, once again, that same ravenous howl from outside. I heard snorting of a mad beast and a crash outside my tool shed. Then a loud, sorrowful howl. I howled back, enraged. I was not in the mental state to make assessments, but did feel, even in my Lycan state, that something was not right, that this should not be. I heard the shed being ripped apart. Howls and growls and insanity. I was not cognizant of how I might leave my enclosure. Of course, I was mindful that I was trapped, and that this thing had returned. If I were sensible enough to consider that I had indeed ridded myself of the beast when I eviscerated young Liam with the gardening shears, then I would be most beyond confused. Yet this was the case. I stood a confused, dumb beast sniffing an enemy in the air while it emerged into my domicile. I could hear my entire home being torn apart. Nothing left to murder but me. Again, this mindless creature, only knowing rage and hunger, was locked helplessly in a cage, unable to escape and unable to fight. It was a matter of time before this surprising entrance was made into my cellar. Then it was. This gargantuan, hideous, silver-eyed demon smashed open the door to my cellar. I awaited its reveal. Yet again, something was not right. Even in my dense, inane, lecherous brain, a mistake had been made. The beast walked down the stairs, as it did that last evening. This time, in the luminescence of the candles that lit up the subterranean chamber, that was my private place, my nightly respite. It was the same massive animal that I knew. It was holding something in the shadows. Then it presented it to me, the head of young Liam. I roared at it, not knowing what this meant if I could assemble any critical thought in my head. It tossed his head at my cage, towards my feet. I stepped back. I remained confused but immensely hostile. I tore at my bars, wanting to attack this intruder. Yet again, I shook the bars, and somewhere in my feeble mind I knew the way out. I had vaguely uncovered the escape mechanism buried deep in my rage-filled mind. The key. Somehow, I knew of the key and looked back and forth for it, while the ginger beast stared at me. I saw it to my right and reached for it. My arms, too massive to get through the narrow bars. I pushed and pushed. I could feel my muscles tearing as my desperation pushed myself to reach it. I was not aware that this beast had its own plan, other than simply watching me. It seemed vengeful as it threw the candles towards the cloth and dried wood in the cellar corner. Then, at the dried grass at my feet, the cellar began to smoke. I coughed and continued wrestling my arm through for the key. I turned back at the visitor once again, while straining for my salvation, and It just stared at me with those glowing eyes, baring its teeth as if to smirk at me. Coughing and shaking the bars to get me access to the key for the first time. And ultimately, the final time, I felt lucid. I seemed to remember my life, my human form, my fur caught fire, and I howled. It spread quickly up my back as I gave one last dive towards the key, cracking my humerus at the same time, yelping in pain from the break and the fire burning my back. I took hold of the key. Finally. And weakly, covered in flames, moved towards the lock, never making it. I collapsed, engulfed in an inferno, no longer able to howl or breathe or live. The ginger beast walked towards the shed, taking one last look at his nephew's body and racing off into the forest before the villagers arrived to witness the blaze and the ruin of Langdale Manor.
Chilling tales for dark nights.